If you were to stand on the edge of the Gili Gili airstrip in late August 1942, the air you breathed would not feel like oxygen, but like a steaming, suffocating blanket of rotting vegetation, diesel fumes, and the sweet, sickly scent of malaria rising from the swamps that encircled Milne Bay, like a festering wound on the eastern tip of Papua. To Commander Shojiro Hayashi of the Imperial Japanese Navy's Special Naval Landing Forces, peering through rain-slicked binoculars from the deck of a transport ship cutting through the dark waters of the Solomon Sea, this place was nothing more than a muddy footnote in the glorious expansion of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a tactical inconvenience to be swatted aside on the inevitable march toward Port Moresby. Hayashi, a man whose career had been forged in the swift, brutal victories of Malaya and the Philippines, did not see a fortress. He seen a mosquito-infested purgatory guarded, according to intelligence briefings in Rabaul, by a disorganized rabble of construction workers and backcountry colonial militia who would likely flee at the first sight of the rising sun flag. He wrote in a letter to his brother in Kyoto, a letter that would be recovered months later from a waterlogged pack on a corpse half buried in mud, a sentence that drips with the fatal arrogance of an empire at its zenith. These Australians are not soldiers, they are laborers with rifles, guarding a swamp that even the devil has abandoned, and we shall do them the favor of relieving them of their misery before the sun sets tomorrow. Hayashi did not know, could not possibly comprehend, that the swamp he dismissed was already waiting to eat his men alive, nor could he see that hiding in the dripping, claustrophobic green hell of the jungle were not just laborers, but men like Corporal Jack Bluey Thompson of the 61st Battalion, a Queenslander who had spent his life cutting cane and breaking horses, a man whose hands were calloused leather and whose patience was infinite. Thompson was sitting in a shallow, water-filled slit trench near No. 3 airstrip, picking leeches off his ankles with the tip of a bayonet, listening to the rain hammer against his helmet like 1,000 tiny drums, a sound that drove men mad if they listened too closely. He wasn't thinking about the grand strategy of the Pacific War or the threat to the Australian mainland. He was thinking about the fact that his boots had been wet for 3 weeks, that his skin was covered in tropical ulcers that wept pus and refused to heal, and that the darkness out there in the bay was hiding monsters. Beside him, Private Fervent Snowy Davies, a 19-year-old from a sheep station in New South Wales, was shivering violently, not from fear, but from the onset of malaria, his teeth chattering a rhythm that cut through the humidity. They were the militia, the Chocos, chocolate soldiers, derisively named by the AIF veterans because they were expected to melt in the heat of battle. But the Japanese were about to discover that chocolate doesn't melt when it's forged in the misery of Milne Bay. It hardens into something jagged and indigestible. The irony of the coming slaughter lay in the Japanese overconfidence, a strategic blindness born of 6 months of unbroken victory where the British, Dutch, and Americans had crumbled before the speed and ferocity of the imperial advance. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa, orchestrating the operation from Rabaul, had allocated a force he considered sufficient for a mopping-up operation, sending roughly 2,000 Marines of the elite Kure 5th and Sasebo 5th Special Naval Landing Forces, men who considered themselves the samurai of the modern age, spiritual warriors who viewed surrender as a stain worse than death. Mikawa's intelligence officers had assured him that the airfield was barely operational, defended by a skeleton crew. In reality, Major General Cyril Close had over 8,000 men, including battle-hardened veterans of the Middle East from the 7th Brigade and thousands of determined militia, waiting in the mud, heavily armed, and digging in deeper every hour. As the Japanese convoy entered the bay under the cover of a thick, impenetrable tropical squall, the first mistake was already being made, a navigational error that would doom hundreds before a shot was fired. The landing barges, disoriented by the driving rain and the treacherous reefs, dropped the vanguard of the invasion force miles east of their intended target, dumping them not on a clear approach to the airfield, but into the mangrove swamps of Ahioma, a tangled nightmare of roots and deep mud where a man could sink to his waist in seconds. Petty Officer Kenjiro Tanaka, leading a platoon of the Kure 5th, stepped off the ramp expecting firm sand and plunged into black slime that smelled of ancient decay, his pristine uniform instantly ruined. his heavy equipment dragging him down. "This is not a landing," he muttered to his second-in-command. "This is a burial." But discipline held. These were veterans, and they dragged themselves out of the primordial ooze, forming up in the darkness, their confidence shaken but unbroken, moving west toward the sound of the waves, unaware that they were marching into a kill zone prepared by men who knew every inch of the treacherous terrain. Miles away at the forward listening post near KB Mission, Sergeant Bill Darky Roberts of the 61st Battalion heard them before he saw them. It wasn't the sound of boots, but the clinking of equipment, the soft guttural commands in a language that wasn't English, and the distinct metallic sound of a tank track squeaking. Yes, tanks. The Japanese had brought 2 light Type 95 Hago tanks, vehicles that were practically useless in modern European warfare, but were terrifying beasts in the jungle, where infantry had no anti-tank weapons. Roberts grabbed the field telephone, his voice a whisper that barely registered over the rain. "They're here," he said, the 2 words sending a jolt of electricity up the line to headquarters, initiating a chain of events that would turn the peaceful coconut plantations into an abattoir. The first contact was a confused, chaotic spasm of violence in the pitch black. A Japanese patrol bumped into an Australian forward sentry, and the silence of the jungle was shattered by the crack of a 303 Enfield and the deeper, faster thud of a Japanese Arisaka. Tracers zipped through the wet air like angry hornets, illuminating brief, terrifying vignettes of men screaming and dying in the mud. Private Davies, the boy with malaria, jerked awake in his trench as the firing started, his fever dream instantly replaced by the cold reality of combat. "Steady, son," Corporal Thompson growled, checking the action of his Bren gun. "Let them come to us." And come they did. The Japanese tactics were predictable, born of arrogance. They didn't flank, they didn't probe. They simply charged down the narrow coastal track, believing that aggression alone would shatter the enemy's resolve. But the militia didn't run. They lay in the mud, invisible, and opened up with a withering crossfire that tore the first wave of attackers to shreds. Commander Hayashi, now on the beach and organizing the advance, was stunned by the volume of fire. "This is not a militia," he screamed at his radio operator. "This is a fortress." The Japanese Marines, used to enemies who broke and fled, found themselves pinned down in the coconut groves, the trees splintering around them as bullets chewed through the soft wood. But the Japanese had an ace up their sleeve: the tanks. The 2 Hago light tanks rumbled forward, their headlights blazing, an act of supreme contempt, daring the Australians to shoot. The bright beams cut through the rain, illuminating the terrified faces of the defenders, freezing them like deer on a highway. The tanks opened fire with their machine guns and 37 mm cannons, the rounds smashing into the Australian positions, turning sandbags and men into bloody mist. Panic, cold and contagious, began to ripple through the forward militia companies. They had no sticky bombs, no anti-tank guns, nothing that could scratch the steel hide of the monsters. Men began to break, scrambling backward through the mud, slipping and falling, abandoning their positions as the tanks ground forward, crushing the wounded under their tracks. It looked, for a terrifying hour, like the Japanese arrogance was justified, that the backcountry boys were breaking. But retreat in Milne Bay was not a rout, it was a withdrawal into deeper hell. The Australians fell back to the Gama River, a swollen torrent of brown water, and waited. Meanwhile, the Royal Australian Air Force Kitty Hawk fighters, the famous No. 75 and 76 squadrons, were grounded by the atrocious weather, their pilots sitting in cockpits on the muddy airstrip, cursing the rain that protected the enemy. Squadron leader Keith Bluey Truscott, a former Australian rules football star turned ace pilot, paced the mess tent, listening to the distant crump of mortars, knowing that his boys were dying just a few miles away and he was powerless to help. "If this rain stops," he told his wingman, "we will turn that track into a graveyard." But the rain did not stop. It intensified, turning the battlefield into a slurry where movement was an agony. The Japanese advance continued through the night, slow and bloody. Petty Officer Tanaka, having survived the initial landing, pushed his men forward, stepping over the bodies of Australian dead. He looked at the face of a young militia boy, lying face up in the rain, eyes wide open in death, and felt a flicker of doubt. The boy didn't look like a coward. He looked like he had died fighting. Tanaka pushed the thought away. They were winning. They always won. By dawn on August 26th, the Japanese had pushed the Australians back to the KB mission, but the cost had been higher than Hayashi had anticipated. His men were exhausted, soaked to the bone, and their supplies were already dwindling because the landing barges had been scattered or sunk by Allied aircraft that had managed a brief sortie before the weather closed in again. The battlefield revealed itself in the grey morning light as a scene from a macabre painting. The coconut palms were shredded, their tops blown off, standing like broken pillars in a temple of ruin. Bodies lay half submerged in the swamp, crabs already feeding on the open wounds. The smell was overpowering, cordite, blood, and the omnipresent rot. Inside the Australian perimeter, Major General Close was playing a dangerous game of chess. He was holding back his veteran AIF battalions, the 210th and 212th, keeping them in reserve, trusting the militia to absorb the initial blow. It was a cold calculation, trading space and militia blood for time to identify the main Japanese thrust. He knew that if he committed his reserves too early to the wrong sector, the Japanese could flank him and take the airstrips. And if the airstrips fell, the Coral Sea battle would have been for nothing. Port Moresby would be next. In Tokyo, the reports filtering back to the Imperial General Headquarters were optimistic, but vague. Bridgehead established, enemy resistance stiff but crumbling. General Hatazo Adachi, commander of the 17th Army, read the cables and nodded. It was going according to plan. He did not know that his elite Marines were currently drinking muddy water and eating raw rice because their field kitchens had been bombed. He did not know that Commander Hayashi was currently staring at a map that didn't match the terrain, realizing that the track to the airfield was a waist-deep bog. The second night brought a new level of horror. The Japanese launched a banzai charge near the Gama River. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a psychological weapon. Screaming Nippon Banzai and its misery to die, hundreds of Marines surged out of the darkness, bayonets fixed, indifferent to their own survival. For Corporal Thompson and the men of the 61st, it was a test of sanity. The darkness erupted with screaming shapes. Thompson held down the trigger of his Bren gun until the barrel glowed red-hot in the rain, the weapon bucking against his shoulder, cutting down rows of attackers who seemed to emerge from the ground itself. "Change barrel!" he screamed to Davies, but the boy was frozen, staring at a Japanese officer who had cleared the parapet, sword raised high. Thompson didn't think. He swung the hot barrel of the Bren like a club, smashing it into the officer's face with a sickening crunch of bone and searing flesh. The officer fell, his sword dropping into the mud, and Thompson finished him with a boot to the throat. "Wake up, Snowy," he roared, slapping the boy. "Wake up or you're dead." The charge broke against the Australian line, leaving piles of Japanese dead tangled in the barbed wire, their bodies forming a grisly ramp for the next wave. But the tanks were still coming. The Hagos clanked forward again, invincible in the absence of anti-tank weapons. The Australians fell back again, giving ground, trading yards for lives. It seemed endless. But then, as the sun rose on the second day, the weather broke. The clouds parted like a curtain, revealing a harsh blue tropical sky. And then came the sound that Commander Hayashi learned to fear more than anything else, the high-pitched whine of Allison engines. The Kitty Hawks were airborne. Squadron leader Truscott led them down, flying so low their propellers kicked up spray from the bay. They didn't just strafe, they obliterated. The Japanese landing barges, stranded on the beach, were turned into burning hulks in minutes, destroying the food, ammunition, and medical supplies Hayashi desperately needed. Then the planes turned their attention to the jungle canopy. The .50 caliber machine guns soared through the trees, turning the Japanese assembly areas into slaughterhouses. Petty Officer Tanaka dove into a crater as the world exploded around him, watching his men being torn apart by rounds the size of fingers. He saw a man next to him simply vanish in a red mist as a cannon shell hit him. "Where is the Navy?" Tanaka screamed at the sky. "Where are the Zeros?" but the Zeros were in Rabaul, grounded by weather or busy elsewhere. The Japanese were alone, naked under the Australian guns. The psychological impact was devastating. The invincible Marines were being hunted like animals. Yet, they did not stop. That night, Hayashi ordered another attack. He had no choice. Retreat was dishonor. He committed his tanks again, pushing toward the KB mission. But this time the Australians were ready. They didn't have anti-tank guns, but they had sticky bombs, socks filled with Nobel's explosive and coated in axle grease, and boys' anti-tank rifles. Private Bluey Thompson watched the lead tank bog down in the mud, its tracks spinning uselessly in the slime. "Now!" he yelled. A soldier from the 210th Battalion, a reinforcement who had just arrived, ran forward from the tree line, ignoring the machine gun fire, and slapped a sticky grenade onto the tank's engine deck. He rolled away just as the explosion gutted the vehicle, the ammunition inside cooking off with a series of pops and bangs. The tank burned fiercely, a funeral pyre in the jungle night, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like demons. The Japanese infantry, stripped of their armor support, faltered. This was the turning point, though no one knew it yet. The momentum had shifted. The backcountry Aussies weren't running anymore. They were holding. And behind the lines, the AIF veterans were moving up, sharpening their bayonets, getting ready to teach the Empire of Japan a lesson in brutality. In the command bunker, General Close looked at the map. He saw the Japanese were overextended, exhausted, and starving. "It's time," he muttered. He picked up the phone to order the counterattack. The hunter was about to become the prey. But for the men in the forward pits, the night was far from over. The jungle was still full of noises, the snap of a twig, the groan of a dying man, the whisper of the wind in the palms. Corporal Thompson shared a tin of bully beef with Davies, eating with dirty fingers, the taste of metallic meat mixing with the smell of death. "You doing okay, kid?" he asked. Davies nodded, his face pale and gaunt. "I just want to go home, Bluey," he whispered. "We all do, mate," Thompson replied, looking out into the dark. "But first we have to kill every bastard out there." And miles away in the ruins of a native hut, Commander Hayashi wrote another entry in his diary, his hand shaking with fever and rage. "They fight like demons," he wrote. "They do not know they are supposed to lose. We are running out of rice. The Emperor is far away and death is very close." The first crack in the myth of Japanese invincibility had appeared, not in a great naval battle, but in a muddy swamp at the end of the world, inflicted by men who were underestimated until it was too late. The laborers were coming for them. The psychological disintegration of a superior force does not happen all at once. It begins as a hairline fracture in the bedrock of their certainty, a subtle tremor that widens with every failed charge and every unanswered cry for support until the entire edifice of their arrogance collapses into the mud. For Commander Shojiro Hayashi, that fracture appeared on the morning of August 27th, not as a catastrophic defeat, but as a gnawing, impossible silence from his supply lines. His elite Marines, men who had marched through Malaya on a diet of victory and rice balls, were now scraping the bottom of their mess tins, drinking water from shell craters that shimmered with oil and dysentery. They were pushed up against the perimeter of the No. 3 airstrip, a cleared strip of kunai grass that looked less like a runway and more like a sacrificial altar under the harsh tropical sun. The Australian defence had hardened from a desperate holding action into a dense interlocking web of machine gun nests and mortar pits, manned now not just by the battered militia, but by the fresh, angry veterans of the 210th Battalion AIF. These were men like Sergeant Dusty Miller, a wharf labourer from Fremantle who had fought Rommel in the desert and learned the trade of killing in the open sands of Tobruk. Miller didn't fear the jungle. He hated it with a professional intensity, hating the way the damp rotted his socks and the way the green canopy swallowed sound. But he treated the Japanese not as mythical warriors, but as targets. Peering over the lip of his pit, Miller watched the tree line where the jungle met the airstrip, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his Vickers machine gun. "Here they come," he murmured to his loader, Private Shorty Evans, as shapes began to detach themselves from the shadows. "Let the bastards get onto the strip." I want them in the open." The Japanese attack, when it came, was a masterpiece of doomed bravery. Lacking artillery support, and with their tanks now smoking ruins or bogged in the mire, they relied on the spirit of Yamato Damashi, the spiritual strength that was supposed to overcome material inferiority. Hundreds of Marines surged from the cover of the palms, screaming, bayonets flashing in the sun, charging across the open ground toward the Australian lines. It was a scene from a previous century, a collision of medieval ethos against industrial slaughter. Miller waited. He waited until he could see the gold teeth in the mouth of the leading officer, until he could see the sweat flying from their faces. Then he opened up. The Vickers gun, water-cooled and relentless, began its rhythmic chugging, spitting .303 rounds at a rate of 500 per minute. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution. The front rank of the Japanese charge simply evaporated, cut down at the waist as if by an invisible scythe. Men tumbled over each other, piling up in mounds of twitching khaki. But the ones behind them kept coming, stepping on the faces of their comrades, driven by a fanaticism that Miller found both terrifying and pathetic. "Die, you stupid bastards!" Evans screamed, feeding a new belt into the breach, the brass casings piling up hot and smoking around their bare feet. On the Japanese side, Petty Officer Tanaka was in the middle of that charge, running through a storm of lead that felt solid enough to lean against. He saw his best friend, a boy from Osaka named Hiroshi, take a bullet in the throat, saw the blood spray out in a bright arterial jet. But Tanaka didn't stop. He couldn't stop. To stop was to think, and to think was to realize that they were charging into a meat grinder. He dove into a shallow depression just as the man next to him exploded, hit by a mortar round that turned him into red mist. Tanaka pressed his face into the dirt, the smell of cordite and pulverized vegetation filling his nose, and for the first time in his life, he felt the cold, hard knot of terror in his stomach. This wasn't war as he knew it. This was industrial disposal of human beings. Back at the forward command post, Major General Close was finally unleashing the hammer he had held back. He ordered the 212th Battalion to flank the Japanese position, to move through the swamps that Hayashi thought were impassable. It was a brutal march. The Australians waded chest-deep through black water that crawled with crocodiles and leeches, holding their rifles above their heads, moving silently, invisibly. Leading a section was Corporal Bluey Thompson, the militiaman who had survived the first nights. He was no longer the uncertain cane cutter. He was the exhausted, hollow-eyed predator. They emerged from the swamp on the Japanese flank just as the sun began to dip, catching Hayashi's forces completely unaware. The firefight that ensued was chaotic and vicious, fought at ranges of less than 10 meters among the root systems of giant banyan trees. Thompson came around a thick trunk and found himself face to face with a Japanese machine gun crew trying to rotate their weapon. There was no hesitation this time. Thompson fired from the hip, his Bren gun bucking, stitching the three men across the chest before they could traverse the barrel. They collapsed in a heap of limbs and equipment. Thompson moved forward, checking the bodies, and saw a photograph flutter out of one of the dead men's pockets. He picked it up with a muddy hand. It was a picture of a woman and a small child standing in front of a cherry blossom tree, smiling. Thompson looked at the dead man, whose face was now a ruin of blood and bone, and felt a strange, jarring disconnect. He shoved the photo back into the dead man's pocket. "Sorry, mate," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Wrong place, wrong time." As night fell, the Japanese position became untenable. They were trapped between the hammer of the fresh AIF battalions and the anvil of the airstrip defenses. Hayashi, realizing that his force was being whittled down to nothing, ordered a withdrawal back towards the Gamma River. It was a humiliation that burned him more than the shrapnel wound in his shoulder, but the retreat was a nightmare in itself. The Kitty Hawks returned at last light, prowling the retreat routes, dropping bombs on anything that moved. The invincible Special Naval Landing Force was now a rabble of wounded, starving men, dragging themselves through the mud, leaving a trail of equipment and bodies behind them. In the darkness of the jungle, the Australians kept pressing, aggressive patrols slipping into the Japanese bivouacs, tossing grenades and vanishing before the enemy could react. It was psychological warfare of the highest order. The Japanese soldiers, who had been told the Australians were soft, were now finding their throats cut in the dark by men who moved like ghosts. Private Snowy Davies, shivering with another bout of malaria fever, sat in an ambush position near a trail junction. He heard the footsteps approaching, heavy, dragging steps. A figure emerged from the gloom, a Japanese soldier using his rifle as a crutch, his uniform in tatters. He didn't see Davies. He just stood there, swaying, looking up at the moon through the trees. Davies raised his rifle, aiming for the center of mass. He could end it. He should end it. But his finger froze on the trigger. The enemy looked so broken. Then a shot rang out from the position next to him. Thompson had fired. The Japanese soldier dropped like a stone. "Never hesitate, kid," Thompson hissed from the darkness. "Mercy gets you killed out here." Davies lowered his rifle, feeling sick, feeling the fever burn behind his eyes. He realized then that the jungle didn't just take lives, it took souls. It stripped away the veneer of civilization until all that was left was the binary choice: kill or die. By the morning of August 29th, the Japanese were broken. They had lost over half their force. The mop-up operation had become a disaster. General Adachi in Rabaul, reading the fragmented reports from Milne Bay, could no longer deny the reality. He sent a cable to Hayashi: "Prepare for evacuation." It was the first time in the Pacific War that a Japanese amphibious invasion force had been ordered to withdraw. The words on the paper were sterile, bureaucratic, but their meaning was seismic. The tide had turned. But for the men on the ground, the order to evacuate didn't mean safety. It meant a desperate fighting retreat to the beaches, pursued by an enemy that smelled blood. Hayashi burned his code books and his maps. He looked at the faces of his surviving officers, hollow, gaunt eyes burning with shame. "We have failed the Emperor," he said quietly, "but we will not give them the satisfaction of our capture." He ordered the wounded who could not walk to be given grenades. It was a final grim act of compassion in their code, a way to avoid the dishonor of being taken prisoner. As the Australians advanced through the Japanese rear areas the next day, they found these scenes of horror, groups of Japanese dead clustered together, their bodies shattered by their own hands. Sergeant Miller, a man who had seen the worst of the Desert War, vomited when he found a field hospital where the patients had been neutralized by their own doctors to prevent capture. "Animals!" he spat, wiping his mouth. "They're bloody animals!" But Thompson, standing nearby, looked at the scene with a darker understanding. He saw the desperation. He saw the fear. He saw what happened when a culture based on absolute victory meets the absolute reality of defeat. "No, Dusty," he said softly. "They're just men who ran out of hope." The Battle of Milne Bay was entering its final gruesome phase. The Australians weren't just pushing the Japanese back, they were hunting them down. The backcountry boys, the militia who were supposed to run, were now the masters of the jungle, and they were exacting a terrible price for every inch of Australian soil the invaders had touched. The myth of invincibility lay dead in the mud, trampled under the boots of cane cutters and wharfies who had decided that this was where the line would be drawn. The retreat from Milne Bay was not a military maneuver. It was a death march through a prehistoric landscape that seemed determined to digest both the conquerors and the conquered. For the remnants of the Cure 5th Special Naval Landing Force, the order to withdraw to the evacuation beaches at Wagga Wagga was a sentence to a slow, agonizing dissolution. They were no longer an army. They were a procession of ghosts, men whose uniforms had rotted off their backs, their bodies consumed by ringworm, malaria, and the gnawing emptiness of starvation. Petty Officer Tanaka, stumbling along a muddy track that smelled of excrement and decay, supported a young private whose leg was gangrenous. The smell of the rotting flesh so pungent it overpowered even the stench of the swamp. Tanaka had stopped thinking about victory or the Emperor days ago. His entire universe had shrunk to the simple, brutal mechanics of putting one foot in front of the other without falling. Behind them, the Australians were coming, moving with a grim, methodical purpose that was terrifying in its relentlessness. The pursuers were no longer the cautious defenders of the airstrip. They were the 212th Battalion, and they were angry. Sergeant Dusty Miller led his platoon through the shattered coconut groves, stepping over the detritus of a defeated army, abandoned mortars, piles of wet ammunition, and the bodies of men who had simply sat down and died of exhaustion. Miller didn't feel triumph. He felt a cold, simmering rage at the waste of it all. "Check them," he ordered his men, gesturing to a pile of bodies. "Check them all. Some of the bastards play dead." Private Shorty Evans prodded a corpse with his bayonet, and when the body didn't move, he kicked it over. The face was a skull barely covered by translucent skin, eyes open and staring at the canopy. "Starved to death," Evans muttered, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the mud. "Didn't even have to shoot him." The fighting during the pursuit was sporadic but vicious, sudden spasms of violence that erupted when a Japanese rear guard, usually just a handful of men too sick to move further, would stay behind to buy time for their comrades. These suicide posts were hidden in the root systems of banyan trees or buried under piles of palm fronds. Corporal Bluey Thompson learned to spot them not by sight, but by smell, the sickly sweet odor of untreated wounds that clung to the Japanese positions. On the afternoon of September 4th, Thompson's section was moving along the coast when the jungle exploded. A Nambu machine gun, firing from a hole dug under a native hut, chattered its deadly rhythm, the rounds shredding the foliage around them. Private Snowy Davies' walking point dropped instantly, a bullet tearing through his shoulder. He screamed, a high, thin sound that pierced the humidity. Thompson didn't dive for cover. He reacted with the blind fury of a man who has seen too much. "Cover me!" he roared and charged the hut. He wasn't running. He was sliding through the mud, firing his Bren gun from the hip, the heavy rounds punching through the thin walls of the hut. He reached the window and tossed a grenade inside, counting the seconds, 1, 2, 3, before rolling away. The explosion lifted the roof off the hut, followed by silence. When Thompson looked inside, he saw 3 Japanese soldiers. 2 were dead. The third, an officer, was missing his legs, but was still trying to reach for his pistol. Thompson stood over him, breathing hard, looking into the eyes of the man who had shot Davies. The officer looked back, his face a mask of pain and defiance, and hissed a single word. "Bakayaro." Idiot. Thompson raised his Bren. There was no mercy left in Milne Bay. He pulled the trigger. Back at the aid station, the scene was a tableau of misery. The wounded Australians lay on stretchers in the mud, waiting for evacuation, their groans mixing with the sound of the rain. Davies lay there, his shoulder bandaged, staring up at the canvas roof. The pain was a dull throb, but the fear was gone, replaced by a numbness that frightened him more. He watched a doctor amputating the leg of a man from the 9th Battalion, working with a saw under the light of a kerosene lantern, throwing the severed limb onto a pile of others. It was a butcher shop. Davies closed his eyes and tried to think of the sheep station back home, of the dry heat and the smell of eucalyptus, but all he could smell was blood and gangrene. He realized then that he would never really go home. Part of him would always be here, in this wet green hell. Nearby, a captured Japanese prisoner, one of the few who hadn't killed himself, sat bound against a tree. He was a boy, no older than 16, shivering uncontrollably. An Australian orderly offered him a cigarette, and the boy flinched as if expecting a blow. When he realized it was a gift, he took it, tears streaming down his face, mixing with the dirt. It was a moment of profound, confusing humanity in the middle of the slaughterhouse, a reminder that the monsters were just children sent to die by old men in distant capitals. On the beach at Wagga Wagga, the evacuation was a chaotic disaster. The Japanese destroyers that were supposed to pick up the survivors were delayed by Allied air patrols. Commander Hayashi stood on the sand, watching the horizon, his uniform a rag, his sword the only pristine thing left. He had fewer than 600 men left out of the 2,000 who had landed. They huddled on the beach, watching the tree line, waiting for the Australians to break through. Hayashi knew that many of his men wouldn't make it to the boats. He walked among them, touching shoulders, whispering lies about food and warm beds waiting on the ships. He stopped in front of Petty Officer Tanaka, who was holding the hand of a dying man. "You did well, Tanaka," Hayashi said, his voice hollow. Tanaka looked up, his eyes dead. "We are leaving them, Commander," Tanaka said, gesturing to the jungle. "We are leaving the dead unburied. Their spirits will never rest." Hayashi looked away. "The living must survive to fight again," he said, quoting a manual he no longer believed in. When the destroyers finally arrived, looming out of the darkness like iron leviathans, the panic began. Men waded into the surf, desperate to escape the island that had tried to eat them. The wounded were carried, dragged, or simply left behind in the crush. The boats couldn't take everyone. As the last barge pulled away, Hayashi looked back at the beach. He saw dozens of his men standing at the water's edge, watching their salvation disappear into the night. They didn't scream. They didn't wave. They just stood there, silhouettes against the dark jungle, waiting for the Australians. Hayashi turned his back on them and wept. The next morning, the Australians reached the beach. It was a graveyard of abandoned equipment and abandoned men. Sergeant Miller walked down to the water's edge, his boots crunching on the sand. He saw a Japanese soldier sitting on a log, staring out to sea. The man had a grenade in his lap, his hand resting on the pin. Miller raised his rifle, but the man didn't move. He didn't pull the pin. He just looked at Miller with eyes that had seen the end of the world. "It's over, mate," Miller said quietly. The Japanese soldier nodded slowly, as if he understood English, or maybe he just understood the tone. He took his hand off the grenade and let it roll into the sand. He stood up, raising his hands. It wasn't surrender, it was resignation. The Battle of Milne Bay was effectively over. The backcountry Aussies had done the impossible. They had stopped the juggernaut. But as Miller looked around the beach, at the bodies washing up in the surf, at the broken tanks and the shattered trees, he didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a survivor of a shipwreck. He sat down on the log next to the prisoner, took out a pack of cigarettes, and lit two. He handed one to the Japanese soldier. They sat there in silence, enemies who had shared the same hell, smoking while the sun rose over the Coral Sea, illuminating the carnage of Japan's first defeat on land. The myth was broken, but the cost was etched into the landscape and the faces of the men who remained. As the destroyers vanished into the Solomon Sea, leaving behind the silence of the abandoned, the true magnitude of what had transpired at Milne Bay began to settle like the silt in the Gamma River. It wasn't a triumphant fanfare. It was a realization soaked in blood and dysentery. Major General Klaus, walking the perimeter of the No. 3 airstrip the next morning, saw the cost of the first defeat. He saw the rows of wooden crosses hastily erected in the mud, marking the graves of men like Private Davies, who didn't die from the bullet, but from the infection that ravaged his weakened body in the days that followed, and the unmarked mounds where bulldozers were burying the hundreds of Japanese dead to prevent disease. This victory had no glamour. It was a grinding, ugly collision of wills where the amateurs had proven to be harder than the professionals. In the command tent, Close read the final casualty reports. 373 Australians dead or missing. It was a number that looked small on paper compared to the thousands dying in Russia, but each digit represented a gaping hole in a family back in Queensland or Victoria, a telegram that would shatter a mother's world. But on the other side of the ledger, the numbers told a story of catastrophe. Of the nearly 2,000 Marines who had landed with the arrogant certainty of conquest, barely 1,300 had been evacuated, most of them wounded or sick. Over 700 dead were left rotting in the jungle. It was the first time the Imperial Japanese Army had been stopped, turned back and broken on land. The spell of invincibility was shattered, not by a great strategic maneuver, but by the sheer stubbornness of men standing in mud. For Commander Hayashi, standing on the deck of the destroyer Tenryu as it steamed towards Rabaul, the disgrace was absolute. He looked at his surviving men, huddled on the deck plates, stripped of their pride and their equipment. They were no longer the samurai of the sea. They were broken biological machines. Hayashi knew what awaited him, the cold, polite condemnation of his superiors, the shame that would stain his family name forever. He touched the hilt of his sword, contemplating the final atonement, but realized with a bitter irony that even death would be an escape he hadn't earned. He had to live with the knowledge that he had been beaten by laborers. In his final report, written days later in a sweltering office in Rabaul, He would write a sentence that was later captured by Allied intelligence. The Australians were not what we were told. They fought with the ferocity of trapped animals and the cunning of demons. We underestimated the land, and we underestimated the men who defend it. It was an admission that came too late for the dead left at Wagga Wagga. Back on the beach, the cleanup was a gruesome task that fell to the survivors. Sergeant Dusty Miller and Corporal Bluey Thompson sat on a log, watching a bulldozer push a crushed Hago tank into a crater. They were exhausted, their uniforms stiff with sweat and blood, their eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness. They didn't speak for a long time. There was nothing to say. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a vast, empty sadness. Finally, Thompson pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, the photo of the Japanese woman and child he had taken from the dead machine gunner. He looked at it for a long moment, the smiling faces staring back at him from a world that no longer existed. He stood up and walked to the edge of the fire, where they were burning blood-soaked bandages and broken equipment. He held the photo over the flames. "Why?" Miller asked, his voice rasping. Thompson watched the paper curl and blacken, the faces disappearing into ash. "Because he doesn't need them seeing this," Thompson said, gesturing to the carnage around them. "And they don't need to know he died in a shithole like this." It was a final act of soldier's grace, a recognition that the enemy was also a victim of the madness. The legacy of Milne Bay wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a psychological pivot point for the entire Pacific War. Field Marshal William Slim, commanding the British in Burma, would later say, "Australian troops had, at Milne Bay, inflicted on the Japanese their first undoubted defeat on land. Some of us may forget that, of all the Allies, it was the Australians who first broke the spell of the invincibility of the Japanese army. But for the men who fought there, it wasn't about breaking spells. It was about the nightmares that would follow them home." Thompson would go back to cutting cane after the war, but he would never be able to stand the sound of heavy rain on a tin roof again. Miller would work the wharves, but he would wash his hands 5-6 times a day, trying to scrub away the phantom sensation of mud and blood. The backcountry boys had saved their country, but they had paid for it with their innocence. As the sun set over the bay on September 7, 1942, the jungle began to reclaim the battlefield. Vines curled around the rusting hulks of the landing barges, crabs scuttled through the empty rib cages of the unburied dead. The war moved on, to Buna, to Gona, to Kokoda, leaving Milne Bay as a silent monument to the folly of underestimation. The irony was complete. The Japanese had come to conquer a swamp guarded by laborers, and the swamp had swallowed them, while the laborers had proven to be the hardest men in the empire. In the silence of history, the voices of the victors and the vanquished merged into the same whisper of the wind through the palm trees, a reminder that in war, victory is just a word for survival, and the only true winner is the grave. The chocos hadn't melted. They had been forged into steel, and that steel would cut the throat of the Japanese Empire all the way back to Tokyo.